This is Rebekah Roth again, and I want to share another story with you about 9/11 and some of the things that happened. You'll remember that I had met a Special Forces soldier that had spent much of the entire day on September 11th on the lawn of the Pentagon. He reassured me that no 757 had crashed at that site. He spent the entire day there. Oh, I can imagine how shocked I was. Well, that was one of our questions. I started to look at the 9/11 story at that point because he had no reason to lie to me from inside the cabin using all my experience. By this time, many of the FBI 302s were out in public. The 9/11 Commission report was out. That's crazy. But they were all telling something that I knew was wrong. Cell phone calls were made from the planes. One of the planes, United Flight 93, they claimed in their government data that cell phone calls were being made from 40,000 feet. And I was like, no way. And more than a dozen people were making successful phone calls on cell phones and sharing this cell phone around the room, around the cabin. I knew that this was completely impossible. And I was driven to figure out why. Were they lying about this? And then I began to see something very interesting. The FBI was changing their story and claiming that the calls actually come from airphones. After all, they weren't cell phones. But unfortunately for them, lots of 302s were out there, had been printed and reprinted in books telling the original story, cell phones. But on American Airlines, their 757s had cell phones or airphones had been deactivated since the beginning of the year. Flight 77 was a 757, so that means Barbara Olson and Renee May, the flight attendant, had to have used cell phones from altitude. And again, that told me that the airplanes had to have been on the ground. Flight 11, the first flight out of Boston, I knew that plane needed to have at least a 10,000-foot runway, as would United's 175. These planes were heavy with fuel. I got on Google Maps and I drew a circle indicating about how far a plane could travel in less than 20 minutes. I found an interesting Air Force base. I later on found it was a reserve base just about 80 miles west of Boston. It's called Westover Air Force Base. Not only did they have a long enough runway, but they also provided a half a dozen huge hangars, big enough for a C-5 transport plane, which is larger than a 767. So I had to take a good look at that. I went on their website. Believe it or not, they had a website. And in that website, I saw photos from inside these huge hangars. They're proud of them. They're huge. And there in the corner, typical really of large airplane hangars, I'd been in several for 747s, were stairs. And those stairs were painted bright yellow. And I thought to myself, were these the stairs that Betty Ong mentioned in several of her transcripts of a taped call? She said he stood upstairs. And that airplane doesn't have stairs on it, so I always wondered, what was she talking about? Was she somewhere where there were stairs? And that struck me as very odd. But later on, I discovered that the FBI had many versions of her 4-minute tape recorded phone call, and that line, he stood upstairs, had been removed from some of them. I was lucky I had printed them out. Later on, I was contacted by a woman who had seen United 767 over Otis, Massachusetts, flying so low that she was sure the plane was going to crash up the road. She was headed out of her home quickly to go head across the way to an appointment. She said the plane was so low, she could clearly see it was United. There was no doubt about that. It was so low, she was certain that it was going to crash. She estimated the time that she'd gone out her front door because she knew how long it was going to take her to get to her appointment. So her estimate was very, very close to the minute that plane would have left its flight plan, which I also had, and headed just north to circle around and land at Westover. Well, I found a website online that allows you to calculate flight time. It's called airplanemanager.com. You can put in various sizes and types of planes and your departure airport, and you have to know the codes, and your arrival airport. And I knew that those planes would be considered heavy because of the fuel load to go transcontinental. I punched in the departure, the arrival airports, and much to my shock, and I mean shock, the flight times of those airplanes were almost exactly a perfect match for the phone calls that were made off all of those flights that day. That, along with Betty Ong saying that mace or something had been sprayed up in business class and they couldn't breathe up there, telling me that the plane certainly was not pressurized, or that would not have been the case. I knew that the planes had landed at Westover. I was later notified by more than one reserve soldier that had been based at that base Westover that told me that they were activated that morning sometime and told to report for duty. When they got to the base, they were told that they were put up in a motel or a hotel nearby, and that the base had been evacuated and that the base was on a complete lockdown. They also told me that they couldn't recall for certain. They spent 2, maybe 3 days being locked out of their base after being activated. So once they heard that I was doing interviews and talking about a base, they knew, and they started to contact me that they knew where, because they'd been locked out. And they thought that was very weird because they were active on duty and stuck in a motel. So eventually several eyewitnesses contacted me to tell me that of their sightings. And again, they had a very good recollection of the time of day, exactly when they were certain that they had dropped off their children, or they were headed for an appointment, they were driving home, they were out walking a dog, and they knew what time they always did these things, that they had a pretty darn good estimate of exactly when that was. And they also had vivid descriptions of either American Airlines or United Airlines that matched perfectly with the time of the landings and the phone calls that were made. So it was, for me, very interesting because all through the interviews, I never mentioned Westover. Also, I noticed that the FBI 302s were later changed. They decided that cell phones weren't made after all. They were all airphones. But that's a problem because the airphones on American Airlines, which supposedly were used by the flight attendant and the passenger, their airphones had been removed by the first of the year. There may have been a phone there, but it was deactivated. Some of them were completely removed. So that's a problem for the FBI, a serious problem. So why was the FBI lying? They lied about the passenger manifest. We eventually found out that airline employees, this is so typical of what we would do, ran to a computer and printed off the manifest. And there were no Arab names on the passenger manifest. I just found it very unusual. Tom Burnett, passenger on United 93, called his cell phone, using his cell phone, and his wife had been a flight attendant. When she looked at her caller ID, she knew that was impossible. It said Tom's phone when he said, "I'm up in the air." She's like, "No, you're not." She thought he was joking. She was a flight attendant. She knew just what I knew, that cell phones don't work at altitude, yet her caller ID said Tom's cell. Shortly after her phone calls, she was contacted by the FBI. Literally, they came to her house. And they started to fight with her that he did not use a cell phone. She said, "Yes, it's right here on my caller ID," but they didn't believe her. Well, Tom also had told her, he'd called 3 or 4 times, stories nebulous that everybody lost count, understandably so, expanding his story, but she never asked the important questions. He never told her. There was no explanation of how many hijackers or who they were or their demands, none of that, which is really unusual for her being a flight attendant. But the FBI showed up at her door and they started to tell her, "No, he couldn't have called from his cell." She's like, "Here's my caller ID. He called from his cell." And they said, "No." And he also told her that there was a gun on board. And she said when she told the FBI that, they said, no, he didn't say that. And she said, Tom has always been a hunter. He knows guns. He knows a gun when he sees one. And the FBI is arguing with her, according to her story, that he didn't have a gun. But you do have to ask yourself this. If there was a gun on the plane or not, how did the FBI know that the official story would claim there wasn't when Tom, who was claiming to be on the plane, was saying there was? Did the FBI know the story beforehand? Had they seen the script? I don't know. I'm just asking. Throughout the many documents that I've read about these phone calls that were made, the FBI has consistently changed their story. I mean, almost every phone call originally came out was a cell. And then they changed it to the earphones. And then there's like, oh, that didn't happen at all. There was no call from Barbara Olson at all. But I knew cell phones didn't work at cruise altitude, so I kept going. Along with Betty telling us the mace didn't circulate throughout the cabin, the cell phones don't work at altitude, I was more than certain that all 4 of those planes had landed. And after my first book, and the coast-to-coast interview that I did, I heard from several actual eyewitnesses that saw those planes landing. And I have pretty much a witness for every airplane that landed at Westover. Even though in all the interviews that I did, I never mentioned the name of the base or the airport. When they contacted me, these eyewitnesses, they all told me, I'll tell you the name of the base. It's Westover, isn't it? And I said, yeah, it is. So when I made this discovery, it literally made me sick to my stomach. After doing the calculations on all 4 of the planes over and over again, and their flight times matched, the phone calls, cell phone calls, didn't matter, all the calls matched perfectly when those airplanes were on the ground. My stomach flipped over like I was on a roller coaster ride. From the inside, was so shocked because we'd always been told that the government, the Air Force, etc., was going to be there for us in these events, but I was starting to unfold something that was a very different story. I spent several days trying to prove myself wrong. I couldn't be right on this. And I did the math over and over and over again, but unfortunately, it all fit together perfectly, tight as a glove. So I worked with my experience and this airplane manager website. I worked it all into my first novel, Methodical Illusion. And I take the main character, Vera Hansen, flight attendant, of course, and walk the reader through the process of putting in the airport codes and choosing the type of aircraft. And so you actually can be walked right through this if you go through that book. Her pilot friend Jim Bowman and her sit and they go through exactly the emotions that hit me when I realized, oh my God, what they told us about 9/11 wasn't even close to the truth. What happened to the planes and the passengers will come out in future videos. So be sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you'll know when the next video drops, because you're not going to believe the real story of 9/11, but it is the true story. So keep your seatbelt fastened. There's much more to come about this most incredible story. You're going to love it and you're going to hate it. I know, because that's what happened to me.